Today I'm going to show you 3 really simple techniques that you can use either to get started with jazz improvisation or to improve your jazz improvisation on pretty much any instrument. I'm going to demonstrate them on the piano, and I will very briefly mention some piano specific stuff, especially about the left hand, but for the most part, like I said, whether you're a piano player or a guitarist or a trumpeter or a violinist, a sax player, whatever, you can take these 3 techniques and start using them to play jazz right now, even if you're a relative beginner. So the first thing we need to do is to look at the chord progression we're going to use to practice our 3 techniques. Just before we go any further, I want to tell you about a really great deal I've got running at the minute. You'll find this particularly appealing if you're a piano player, because I'm running a bundle deal on the digital editions of my 3 current books. How to Really Play the Piano, the stuff your teacher never taught you, 7 studies in pop piano, and an introduction to cocktail piano. Right now you can get the digital editions of all 3 of those books for £18.95, which is a saving of 30% on what you would pay if you bought them separately. If you've already got one of them, by the way, don't worry, because you can still get a discount on the other 2. To find out more about that deal, head over to billspianopages.com/bundle. So here we are, here's our progression. It is 8 bars long, or 8 measures long if you prefer the US terminology, and it's in 4/4 time, which is to say we've got 4 beats in every bar. We're in the key of B flat major, which might come as a little bit of a surprise to you, because as you can see, the first chord is E flat major 7, and very often the first chord of a progression is the tonic chord, the chord that the key is named after. But it isn't always. The first chord of a progression isn't a reliable guide to the progression's key. And here we are definitely in the key of B flat major 7, but the first chord is E flat major 7. Okay, just a minor detail to be aware of there. Now the great thing about this progression is that it works as a loop. In other words, the final chord takes us back very naturally to the first chord, which means we can play it over and over and over and over again, which is great for practicing improvisation. So what I'm going to do now is just go through the chords we've got, just to give you a kind of sense of the kind of underlying architecture that we're working with here. If you're not familiar with the terminology of chords and harmony, don't worry too much. As long as you can spot which notes I'm playing, that's the main thing. That's the stuff we're going to be using later. Anyway, bar number 1, we have a full bar of E flat major 7, 4 beats. Then in bar 2, we have a full bar of F7. Bar 3 is B flat major 7 for 4 beats. And then in bar 4, we've actually got 2 chords. We've got 2 beats of D minor 7 and 2 beats of G7. In bar 5, we've got a full bar of C minor 7. And in bar 6, a full bar of F7, again, just like we had in bar 2. You might notice I'm playing that in a slightly different shape from the way I played F7 in bar 2. Really important point if you're not familiar with chord instruments like the piano and the guitar. What gives a chord its identity is the notes it contains, so F, A, C and E flat in the case of F7, not the order you play them in. So you can play those notes in different orders, different voicings to use the technical term, for different musical effects, but wherever you play those notes on the piano, it stays an F7 chord. Okay, all of these are F7 chords. Just an important point to bear in mind there. So that takes us to the end of bar 6. Then in bars 7 and 8 we have what we call a turnaround section. Now a turnaround briefly re-establishes the tonic chord, so we feel like we're at home. We'll come to that in a second. But then it's like the kind of little outboard motor stuck on the back of the progression that powers you back to the beginning. Yeah, it's the kind of engine that drives the loop effect of this progression. So this little turnaround goes like this. At the start of bar 7, we have 2 beats of the tonic chord, B flat major 7. Then we have 2 beats of G minor 7. Then going into bar 8, we've got 2 beats of F minor 7 and 2 beats of F diminished 7, and as you can hear, that takes us back really nicely to E flat major 7, which is the first chord in the progression. Okay, let me just play it through and count so you can kind of get a feel for it, because really that's the most important thing of all. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Can you hear how that little turnaround kind of sets us up there for the E flat major 7 chord? Okay, so if you're a piano player, obviously, but if you do have a keyboard or a piano, maybe just play around with those chords a little bit to get the feeling of how this progression works. I just want to quickly mention something you might spot me doing later in the tutorial, because I don't want it to take you by surprise. That is chord substitution, which is a really common technique if you're playing jazz piano or jazz guitar or any chord-based instrument. Basically, what a substitution is where you take one chord from a progression and replace it with another chord that sounds different but which does the same job in terms of the progression's structure. It has the same function, to use the technical term. Now, there are two places where I'm likely to do that in this progression. One of them is on the G7 chord in bar 4. Okay, so if you look at bar 4, it goes D minor 7, G7, and takes you down to the C minor 7 chord in bar 5. Yeah, I might substitute that G7 chord and instead use a D flat major 7 chord, or maybe even a D flat 7 chord. Okay, that has a very similar effect, it just sounds different. D minor 7, D flat major 7, C minor 7. It just takes us smoothly down to that C minor 7 chord, just like the G7 does. It's a type of tritone substitution, if you're familiar with that terminology. A more classic tritone substitution that I'm likely to use is on the F7 chord, F7 being the number 5 chord in the dominant 7th chord in the key of B flat major, which is what we're in. Instead of playing an F7 chord, you might see me play B7, or maybe even C diminished 7, both of which will have the same function, okay, but a different sound as the F7 chord. So if you see me playing those chords, especially in the left hand, that's what I'm up to. It's not that I've gone wrong or I've changed the progression or something like that. Okay, if you're not a piano player, you might want to skip this next section of the tutorial, because I'm just going to be talking about how to work up a piano left hand part based on that chord progression. Fortunately, YouTube makes it really easy for you to skip forward these days. All you need to do is look at the red progress bar at the bottom of the video screen, and you'll see it's divided into sections, or chapters as YouTube calls them. Just drag the red playhead button to the start of the next chapter and you can start finding out about our first technique for getting going with your improvisation. Alternatively, hit the relevant timestamp in the description text underneath the video. Okay, greetings fellow players of the piano forte. Congratulations on your excellent taste in instruments. Let's just have a quick look at a really easy left hand part that you can use here. I'll just play it through, and if you want you can just copy it, but I'll talk about one or two alternative things you can do as well. Okay, so I would typically do this in the first bar, E flat major 7. In the second bar, I will play a rootless voicing of F7. Okay, it's called rootless because it doesn't have a root, there's no F in there, okay, but it still functions as an F7 chord. If you wanted to, you could play a regular F7 just there, or down there, but as a shell chord probably, else it would sound too muddy as a full chord, okay. I like my rootless voicing there. Okay, so that's bar 2. Bar 3, B flat major 7, really easy. Bar 4, D minor 7, G7, or if you want to try that substitution, D minor 7, D flat major 7. I would almost always play D flat major 7 rather than D flat 7, but both will work. In bar 5, C minor 7, and in bar 6 I would almost always substitute that F7 chord, okay? I would almost always play B7 or C diminished 7, yeah? Then in the turnaround, B flat major 7, G minor 7, probably as a shell chord, F minor 7, F diminished 7. You don't have to start playing the left hand straight away to use the 3 techniques I'm about to talk about, yeah? If you want to, just start playing around with them in the right hand and then add the left hand later, but that's just giving you something kind of in your armoury, in your toolbox that you can play around with in the left. So our first technique is a little bit old school. People have been using this technique to learn and teach improvisation for centuries, probably. But it often gets overlooked, and that's a shame, because as well as teaching you some really good basics of the art of improvisation, it also really helps with your confidence, which is often a big issue when you start out with improv. You've got all these notes to play. How on earth do you know where to start? Basically, what it involves is limiting the number of notes you can play. Okay, so instead of having 88 notes at your disposal, or 100 notes, or 50 notes, or whatever the range of your instrument happens to be, you restrict yourself to just 2 or 3. Let's look at how that might work in the context of our chord progression. We're in the key of B flat major. There's the scale of B flat major, B flat C, D, E flat F, G, A, and back to B flat. I'm just going to pick 3 notes from that scale: G, B flat, and C. And I'm going to improvise a solo using just those 3 notes. Yeah, and I'm going to play the chords in the left so you can hear the chord progression as you go. By the way, if you're playing a melodic instrument and thinking, how on earth do I keep track of the chords? I've got a way of doing that in a minute. Just bear with me. Let me demonstrate this first. Here we go. Back at the start of the progression. Yeah, let's just look at what I was doing there. First of all, I was deliberately not just playing the notes in order. Okay, I wasn't just doing this, although you might do that to get comfortable with them to start with. Instead, although I was restricted to 3 notes, I was really playing around with the stress, the phrasing, and the rhythm that I was using. With just 3 notes, you can create an awful lot of different effects. Even if you're just playing G, B flat, C going up, you can phrase that in lots of different ways. Yeah, you can really play around. And that is how to get into this exercise. Run the loop over and over and over, just playing around with 3 notes. And when you've done it with 3 notes, try 4. Try G, B flat, C, and D. Yeah, and so on and so on and so on, building out. Now, what happens if you're, I don't know, a clarinetist or something, and you don't have the chords? Well, I've solved that problem for you, because if you look in the description text underneath this video, you will see a link to an MP4 file, an audio file that I'm actually going to post in a couple of places, which you can download, which is a recording of me just playing the chords in time. Okay, so you can run that. You can run that track. I'll probably loop it. I haven't recorded it yet. I'll probably loop it 6 or 7 or 8 times over, so you get a good shot at it, and you can practice your 3 or 4 or 5 note improvisation over that. Technique number 2 is in some ways quite similar to technique number 1, in that we're still making our lives a bit easier by limiting the number of notes we can play. But it's also a bit more adventurous than technique number 1, and you can make some more interesting sounds. Now, rather than spilling the beans right away, what I'm going to do is use this technique to improvise through the progression once, and I want you to see if you can work out what I'm doing. Like last time, in the left, I'm just going to play the chords. Don't worry about what's happening down there. All of the action is happening in the right hand. Okay, here we go. See if you can work out what I'm doing. Yeah, so it was a fairly melodic improvisation I had in the right there, quite simple, but there was, some sense of phrasing, some sense of melody. But I was limiting what I was doing. Did you spot how? If you were watching carefully, and if you know your chords, we'll come on to chord knowledge in a second, you might have seen that what I was doing in the right hand was just confining myself to the notes of the underlying chord. Okay, so if I had E flat major 7 in the left hand, I just used the notes of E flat major 7 to improvise on. If I had F7, even if it's in a fancy rootless voicing like the one I was using there, I use the notes of F7. Even if I substituted the left hand chord and played the tritone sub, I stuck to the notes of F7 in the right hand. If I had C minor 7, I use the notes of C minor 7. Okay, so more challenging, but it's still easier than having every note at your disposal, if you like. And it's a good kind of halfway house between technique number 1 and full improvisation, because you can be much more adventurous, you can create phrases much more easily, but you still kind of have the safety of knowing that the notes you're going to play are kind of okay. 2 things. First of all, focus on creating, if you can, good flowing phrases. This isn't necessarily easy to start with, but one trap you can fall in with this technique, and one of the reasons that sometimes I'm a bit reluctant to get people doing it, is that your playing in the right can become very kind of siloed, in that you can say, right, E flat major 7, now I will play the notes of E flat major 7, F7, now I will play the notes of F7, next I've got B flat major 7, play those notes, next I've got, and so on and so on, and it gets very disjointed. So you must think about creating a logical flow. That's not too difficult. When you consider how many of those chord notes from the different chords are either next to each other or shared, okay? Play around and see what you can do. Now, on the subject of chord knowledge, this is a situation where if you are someone who plays a one-note instrument, like the clarinet or the trumpet or whatever, you need some chord knowledge. And that's good, okay? But this is your kind of impetus to learn more about chords, because all improvisers on all instruments really need to know about chords, unless you are purely doing it by ear, which is very limiting. Yeah. So if you're playing the clarinet or whatever, now is the time to work out what those chord notes are. And if that means that you have to skip back to the start of the tutorial and look at the basic chords I was playing and say, yes, this is an F7 chord, this is a B flat 7 chord, so here I can play these notes, here I can play these notes, then fine. It's a fair bit of donkey work, but that is going to really free you to use this technique and start creating some interesting improvisations. Our final technique is in some ways the simplest but the most powerful of the 3. All you have to do is sing. Now, so many musicians overlook singing as a learning and a practice tool, and that's a shame because it's incredibly powerful. When you sing, you're engaging in the most fundamental of all human musical activities, and you're tapping directly into your musical subconscious. And your subconscious brain is a much more instinctive and a much faster musician than your conscious brain. The problem is, when you're learning jazz especially, you study a lot of books and a lot of videos, and you tend to absorb a lot of theoretical information, and that can kind of trap you into a kind of very algorithmical, hyper-rational way of thinking about improvisation. And that's bad, because what you end up doing is saying, right, I've got this chord in the progression, so I know that I can improvise over that chord using the notes of this scale. Now it's this chord, so I know I can improvise over that chord using the altered dominant scale, so I'll do that. And then it's this chord, so now I know I can use the Mixolydian scale, so I'll do that. But the problem is, no capable improviser ever thinks like that. When you watch a capable improviser at their instrument, 3 things are going on in their head. First of all, yes, there may be a certain amount of scale-based thinking, okay? When I think about scales as I improvise, it tends to be in quite specific circumstances. So if I'm playing a bit of jazz, for example, sometimes I might say to myself, okay, right now, I really want the kind of whole tone scale sound, and I'll mess around a little bit on the whole tone scale. Or I might say to myself, I want a really plain and simple sound, so I'll go for the pentatonic scale. Okay, really straightforward and plain. But that's only part of what's going on. 2 other things are happening. First of all, there is kind of muscle memory. You're just pulling out little bits of, that's a really bad way of describing it, but it's the best way I can think of. You're pulling out little bits and pieces of things that you've learned in the past that you know will slot in particular places. So, little bits of riff, little bits of, lick or run or whatever, just stuff that you've learned and practiced in the past and will fit in the particular place that you are, the particular thing you're playing at any given moment. And that just comes from experience. You need to practice to get there, but you can build up a toolbox of techniques you can use actually quite quickly, and the technique I'm going to talk about in a second will help you to do that. But third, and most importantly, when you're improvising, if you're a good improviser, you tend to use your ear. You have a sense of what notes will sound good if you play them next. That's much easier if you're playing an instrument you blow into. Like, I actually find it really easy to improvise on the trombone, even though I'm not a very good trombonist. And I think that's probably because it's closer to singing. It's almost more natural than playing the piano or playing the guitar or whatever. But if you can develop that ability to hear what should come next, then it will give you not only a much more fluent improvisational ability, but also a much better and more musical sound. Now, you might say to yourself, well, surely, Bill, that's just talent. You must just have a good ear. Absolutely not. My ear is terrible, okay? I do not have a ton of kind of innate musicality. This is something I've learned to do by practicing and, yes, by singing. So let's look at an exercise you can use to put this technique into practice, and one that will help you to kind of link your musical subconscious with your conscious brain. What we're going to do is take our chord progression that we've been working through, and maybe to start with, just take the first kind of 4, 5, 6 chords from it and play them through, or listen to them if you've got the audio file and you don't have a piano or a guitar or whatever. Play or listen to them, and as you do, try to sing a phrase over the top, something like this. Give yourself a starting note, that'll make it easier. Okay, so I'm going to start on B flat. Here we go. Do 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 do. Right, let's stop there. Now, next stage is to try to recreate what you've just sung on your instrument. Let's try to do it while it's fresh in my brain. It was something like this. Now, can you hear that I've developed a really natural sounding phrase there? It's quite cool. It's probably better than what I would have come up with if I were approaching things purely algorithmically, purely by messing around with scales. And I've managed to translate it onto my instrument, and that might take a little bit of practice, but it's really worth doing, because what you can now do is take that little bit of phrase and add it to your toolkit of improvisation. So let's just try it again. Yeah, there's a little thing that I can drop into an improvisation sometime. And just try that. It might not be easy at first, especially if you're not a very confident singer, but really do try it. Just sit down and play through the chords, have a go, try singing some phrases, work them out on your instrument, learn them, wash, rinse, repeat. You will be surprised at how quickly that exercise begins to develop your ability to hear what should come next when you're soloing. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. I hope you're going to find those techniques useful. Let me know what you think about them in the comments, and while you're down there, remember to hit the like button and also the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed to my channel and you'd like to see much more content just like this. I'm also on social media. Check out the description text below for Twitter, Facebook and Instagram links, and don't forget the book deal that I mentioned a few minutes ago. 3 of my ebooks for just £18.95, a saving of 30% on what you'd normally pay. You might also like to check out my Patreon crowdfunding page. Lots of great goodies on there. Doesn't cost very much to support me on Patreon, but we have a really good community going on. Please do check it out. Okay, get off to your instruments, start practicing, start putting those techniques into practice, and I'll see you next time.